All right, welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. A live look at the White House. The time just past 9:30 in the nation's capital. It's a story that we've been covering for days at this point, previewing for days especially. Hundreds of senior military leaders being summoned from around the world for today's unusual meeting with Secretary Pete Hegseth at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, Virginia. Hegseth promoting the new name, the Department of War, although it has not officially been changed by Congress yet. Hegseth also rolling out new directives about physical fitness, slamming what he said were, quote, fat troops, and added that it's completely unacceptable to see fat generals and admirals in the halls of the Pentagon and leading commands around the world. It's a bad look, Hegseth said. He also said that the U.S. must be prepared for war and must be prepared to win. He said it's not because we want war. No one here wants war, but it's because we love peace. Host of the Strap podcast and retired Marine Intelligence Officer Hal Kempfer is here. Hal, now that the meeting is done, do we have any more clarity on why this meeting had to happen in person?
Well, Austin, it's not uncommon that commanders across the world, to include the civilian commanders of various departments, agencies, will want to meet with their subordinates, their staffs or whatever, and give them the word personally. Now, with what was said today, a lot of people have said, hey, they could have done that by video teleconference or even email. There wasn't anything, and of course it was televised nationally, which was kind of unusual. That's something that I think most did not expect, and so gave him this speech, with and both, they kind of laid out, both the president and Secretary Hegseth kind of laid out their principles. Now, there is some controversy that Secretary Hegseth's dealing with. The national security strategy is being staffed right now at the most senior levels, and reportedly he has gotten some pushback to include from very senior commanders, to include Dan Kane, the general who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was personally picked by both Hegseth and by President Trump to be in that position. And so it's kind of interesting to see what was happening, but it was a very unprecedented meeting across the board. And it was, in some ways, it kind of sounded a lot like a campaign rally.
So I mentioned at the top that Hegseth underscored that we must be prepared for war and we must be prepared to win, underscoring again, not because we want war, Hegseth said. No one wants war, but it's because we love peace. That, to me, raises the question, who do we need to be ready for war with, Hal? Who are the primary people, entities, nations that you look at?
Normally my quick answer would be obviously our near peer competitor, which would be China. And of course, that is who we do need to be prepared to go to war with. China has indicated that it will try to forcibly seize Taiwan, and it has made broad claims across the South China Sea that are in violation of international law. And the U.S. has said that it will defend Taiwan, and China's claims puts other countries like the Philippines and others at great risk, to include, and Japan, I should mention, who are close allies to the U.S. So that would be my quick answer. On the other hand, President Trump kind of made it clear that we're going to look at the enemy within, if you will, looking at U.S. cities and possibly using U.S. cities as a training ground for the military, that they would do more here at home. There is an emphasis in what I understand, the draft national security strategy, to look at the U.S. homeland and to look more at the Western Hemisphere, and that fits certainly with what we've seen with designating the drug cartels as narco terrorists, and the strikes we've done on their boats in the Caribbean, and of course the discussion that there may be plans for strikes actually in Venezuela on narco terror targets. So that could be part of what came out of it. I mean, it's not quite clear. So it could be looking more at the homeland, and it could be looking at the big near peer competitor. What I didn't see was things that would indicate Europe or the Middle East was a primary concern, and that's a big shift from where we were before.
No one was fired today, correct?
As far as I could tell, I think the biggest news today was what did not happen. There was all sorts of conspiracy theories and speculation on what could happen. And the thought was that they roll into that room, and the reason they wanted to see them in person was because that they were going to call out names and fire them or demote them on the spot or something like that. That did not happen. Nothing of the sort. Although Secretary Hegseth was probably looking at the room very closely because he gave a rather impassioned speech about height and weight requirements, and he was tired of seeing what he said was fat troops and fat generals and admirals in the Pentagon. And I'm sure everybody was kind of sucking in their stomach when he said that. But that is an issue, and certainly, Pete Hegseth, he comes from the Army side. I think a couple of years ago there was a study that said that 70% of the soldiers were technically obese by the definition of that term. And I've also seen that somewhere between, 18 to 40% of soldiers in the Army are outside of standards. So he was bringing that up, and that does happen. It happens a lot. You see in the Pentagon and some other places because, well, frankly, when you're out in the field and you're doing stuff all the time, extremely active. As an infantry officer would be as a lieutenant or a captain. If you're busy doing that stuff, it tends to burn off a lot of calories, and then you get transferred to some place like a headquarters, and they don't burn off the calories as fast, but they may eat just as fast, and so that has been a perennial problem. I'm going to show some bias here, but statistically backed bias. The Marine Corps probably has the least problem. I mean, we're not saying the Marine Corps does not have weight issues, but the Marine Corps, generally speaking, is not the service with the biggest problem. And I've heard Air Force generals today talking about it. They said the Air Force has a problem in this, and that's true. Usually, services that where you just don't move around a lot, that tends to be true. In the Air Force, they fly, but they tend not to do a lot of ground movement, a lot of field exercises. The Navy is also kind of notorious for having weight issues as well. So, but he brought that out, and he made some rather impassioned discussion about DEI and all the ways he defines that, and made a remark about quote dudes in dresses unquote, and making it very clear that a lot of these things that we may have seen in past years are no longer going to be tolerated within there. And he also talked about beards. In fact, he uses the term quote beardos unquote, which is kind of an interesting term. But there are some African Americans often have what they're called, if you shave every day, you get razor bumps. I've got close friends that back in the 80s when we didn't have shaving waivers or whatever, that would go to had to do some rather interesting stuff in order to maintain a clean shaven look. And during the war on terror, particularly with all the special operations units doing modified grooming standards, that all changed. And so you saw a lot of beard waivers, and obviously, as you can see, he's going away from that. He wants to go back to the clean shaven look, and so that was a big part of his speech, and of course his warrior ethos.
Warrior ethos. I asked you last week what warrior ethos means to you. Maybe it's worth re-asking that question again today.
Well, warrior ethos, and it's interesting. I find it rather interesting that there's a commandant in the Marine Corps that actually pushed this in the late 80s and talked about we need to get to our warrior roots. And that's where the warrior thing kind of became incumbent within that. Strangely enough, he's also a commandant who I thought was a great commandant, but was a little heavy set. And I know in the Marine Corps, there were comments that were said about that. And I'm sure that he would have been probably pointed out if he was there today. But he was a great leader. But it's the idea of being ready for war, and this is a key point. He made it very clear that we need to get ready for war, and I think some of the if I may, one of the reasons that he's talking about these things is we've done a lot of things in the services, looking at a lot of different issues, but not necessarily focused on our effectiveness in war fighting. And what we're looking at is what we're going to face in a major theater war, a major war with China. The hardships, the demands, physical demands on the troops, and looking at what's going to have to be done. And we're wondering if maybe we put some other issues ahead of that combat effectiveness tool. And in fairness, all right, there are, he talked about women. There are women who have made it through Ranger School. That is one of the toughest schools in the Army. And I've served with female Marines and soldiers, and I've had them under my command who are just as tough, just as ready for combat as anybody else. But I will say this: a 90-pound rucksack or 90 pounds worth of gear respects no one. And if you carry 90 pounds worth of gear and you're smaller, and it's gonna obviously weigh on you, so to speak, a lot harder than someone who's bigger. And that's just one of the realities of combat. Same thing with artillery shells; they don't have a variation on that. So he was bringing up that that they have to maintain the same standards, certainly in the combat arms field. When I came in, women were barred from combat arms. That's been changed, obviously. But he does bring up some points, which is, when you start to get into some of these fields like the infantry, special operations, some of that stuff, you have to maintain high physical standards just because of the high physical demands of the job. When I was in amphibious reconnaissance, frankly, it was almost like, in some ways, if you looked at the physical requirements to stay really where you needed to be, it was almost like being a professional athlete. We're constantly training hard, a lot of physical training. So it's there are fundamental reasons why he said what he said.
So we'll play out some of Hegseth's remarks. He did speak at length today in front of that crowd. Before we get to that, though, Hal, I got to ask you about the story of the day, the other story of the day, if you will. We're expecting a government shutdown to begin in 2 hours and 16 minutes. So at midnight Eastern time, all indicators seem to suggest that it's imminent. The government is going to be shutting down. What happens to the military if the government gets shut down? What happens to troops? What happens to the top brass? What do people need to know?
That's a great question. What happens is the military keeps going. Now, they will see their paycheck for the first. That will happen. However, if the thing goes beyond, say, a couple of weeks, there is, and this has happened before, there is a chance that they will miss a paycheck, which would be the one in the middle of the month. And I have to tell you, for the more senior officers and senior staff NCOs, a delay on a paycheck like that isn't the end of the world. But if you're a junior enlisted soldier and you're kind of living paycheck to paycheck, missing a pay period like that can have rather significant consequences. Of course, things like being reimbursed for travel, if you're, if you travel a lot and you have to use a government credit card, that will be delayed. There'll just be a lot of delays in a lot of things. And the last time this happened, which was under the first, or last time we saw something really big like this, I think, and I harken back, I think 7 years, but it was under the first.
Yep, just under 7 years ago.
Yeah, 7 years ago. It took a while to get the gears of government, so to speak, back working again. Because once you shut everything down, it just takes a long time to get it back going. And a lot of people had, pay and reimbursables in arrears. And again, for the military, that can be a big thing. It also will, show up in other areas if it goes long enough where you'll start seeing degradation of the force structure across the board.
So yeah, what you're referring to, because I happen to have it right in front of me. It was just under 7 years ago. It happened during the first Trump administration in 2019. That was a 34-day-long shutdown. I was just asking some of our experts and analysts before you came on how long they expect this one to happen, how long they expect this to last. It's impossible to know at this point. Hal Kempfer, thanks for coming on. The host of the Strat podcast. You can listen to Strat anywhere podcasts are available. Always good to see you, Hal. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Austin.